Yes, Professor. So hi everyone. So today I'd like to welcome all of you to the Pi seminar series dedicated to advancements in scientific machine learning. And today I'm excited to announce that we have with us Professor Michael Brenner, who is joining us from Harvard. Professor Michael Brenner is the Michael F. Cronin Professor of Applied Mathematics at Harvard and a research scientist at Google Research. And today he will be giving us a talk on scientific uses of automatic differentiation. So over to you, Professor, for the rest of the session.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you all for having me. I'm going to tell you about a kind of research philosophy and also a research program that we've been carrying out at Harvard actually for the last couple of years. There's a little bit of work at Google, which I'll flag when I get to it. But yeah, and maybe okay, let me sort of start with the preamble. So as you all know, there's a lot of interest in using machine learning for science and what is the right way to basically do this? What I would claim is that like the advances in machine learning that occurred, I mean, even without the question of whether how do you use machine learning best to sort of solve scientific problems? What's clear is that the sort of machine learning models of the day sort of all solve hard non-convex optimization problems using methodologies that I think roughly we were scared to use on scientific problems. And science is littered with such problems. And the thing that we got interested in is that just the idea that the technology behind machine learning, which I will differentiate from machine learning, really provides an opportunity of revisiting and solving such problems. So that's those are two main points. Another point that I will make that will become clear later on is that I think one of the things that the science community, and by science community, I really mean the computational science community, which we all, I think, live in. One of the reasons that we haven't advanced as rapidly as the machine learning community has is that we basically don't tend to have well-defined benchmarks and competitions to iteratively improve things. Our code is not as one can't iterate on it as much. And I think that one of the things that we in the community that we're all in have to sort of understand is what are the lessons basically that we can take from the advances in machine learning to apply productively to science. And I guess my sort of the underpinning of this is that I don't there's lots of efforts of just running machine learning models on scientific data sets. I think that the underlying lessons are much deeper than that. And this talk and also the research that we've been doing has been aimed at trying to get at that. So I mean, what I would ask is, imagine that you choose your favorite non-convex optimization problem, and imagine we had plots, for hard science problems, accuracy of prediction of, whether there will be hurricanes, accuracy of hurricane prediction 2 years out as a function of time. Imagine we actually had plots of performance as a function of time and people were competing on them. There are lots of important problems that we know what they are, like probability of wildfire occurring in a place, basically, but predicted, say, 1 year out, like far enough out that it's actually, an interesting prediction problem. And, if we as our community had performance as a function of time plots and such things, then we could compete upon them and improve model performance. And I think that this is what we've seen from the machine learning community. So anyway, so with this as sort of a preface, our approach basically to going after this has been basically the following. What we do is, so we're interested in solving the laws of physics. So what we do is we take the laws of physics, basic physics-based simulators, and we rewrite them in a differential programming language of the sort that underlies machine learning. And we tend to write code in JAX, but you can do this in several different libraries, PyTorch, TensorFlow, whatever makes you happy, to do this. Examples that I will discuss in this talk that we've been sort of building, using this on our molecular dynamics engines, either for materials design or molecular modeling, CFD solvers, sort of solving engineering problems, engineering fluid mechanics problems, or general circulation models for weather and climate, and then also just problems in biology, cell division models. And so what we tend to do is to write a simulator like this. This is sort of become easier over time, but this tends to be a lot of work. We can't use legacy codes to do this because they don't have the functionality. This will come out in my talk. We then choose some design goal or objective function. And then what we do is we use the fact that natively when written in JAX, the we then use gradient. We use the optimizers, the inherent optimizers, to solve problems. Either they might be like a fluid mechanics optimization problem, which I'll get to, or it might be, making a model that's better to solve a class of problems. And I will sort of discuss, at least in this talk, there are examples of both. And I mean, the thing that's interesting about this is that the cost of computing a single gradient is independent of the number of parameters. Just as is true for adjoint methods. But and that this basically makes it possible to solve problems that one couldn't otherwise. And there's sort of finding solutions to classical problems that couldn't be solved. I mean, the two classes of these are finding classical. There are lots of classical problems that we just never even thought to try to solve or formulate as an optimization problem because there was kind of no hope, which I think are now quite amenable. And then there's also the just developing entirely new models. So we use machine learning approximations when needed in this research program, but we're quite sparing about it. And we tend to use it as a modeling tool to create better parameterizations. So this is, I think, rather different. I mean, there's a community, which tries to just throw machine learning at problems. And while the methodology that's outlined in this slide contains that as a special case, I think this is really the sort of, from my point of view, the main philosophical difference between the way that we're approaching it and many others are. By the way, this is a small group. People should feel free to interrupt and ask questions. So I have a lot of slides here. I'm not going to get through it. And I would prefer to explain to you just at a high level what we're doing and then go through a couple of examples. And if people have questions or if there are things you're interested in, please just stop me. Does that make sense? Could somebody say something?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Is that cool? Okay. So the goal, so I, at least as a computational scientist, I mean, I'm curious, I mean, if you all feel this way, I feel that like a decade ago, I mean, I've been a computational scientist, I guess, my whole scientific career, so it's been quite a while, but I never thought there was such opportunity as there is now to actually build models that matter and that really are important for sorting out the problems of our time. So our goals are really quite ambitious. I would like to be able to, dramatically improve the state of the art of computational models of complex systems in various fields. There's been a lot of talk during at least my scientific, the last 25 years, say, of modeling complex systems. But I think that the reality is that the models of complex systems aren't accurate enough to actually be able to use them for many practical situations. And one has to always include experiments within the loop in order to do this. And what that means is that computational scientists aren't able to lead the scientific discovery. And I think, AlphaFold as an example really changes that paradigm, that by simply, and not simply because it's quite difficult, by making a model that is accurate enough, that passes some accuracy threshold, that one can literally change the way that people actually solve science problems in a field, I think is an inspiration, to do that more. And it's a difference. It's kind of different type of scientific problem than the sort of applied math of my youth, when we would, derive asymptotic approximations and be happy, with the fact that we understood mechanistically what was going on. This is really about driving the error down, basically, and getting it down to be low enough that we actually can change the way that problems are solved. So that's sort of the first two bullets in the goal. And then there's this other bullet that I said with solving optimization problems that matter. And I think that that's interesting too. So what I'm gonna do in this talk, and there are way too many slides in this talk for me to be able to go through. So I actually would appreciate if people have specific interests. I imagine I'll get through two of these actually in the course of this talk. My whole research group is actually is focused around the motivation that I just gave you. I mean, people are working on all kinds of different problems. And, if you look at the papers, a graduate student walked in and showed me papers.
There is one question in the chat. Professor Ricky, are you there or you left?
I'm still here. I'll have to leave in just a minute or so.
Okay, so if you can ask your question, that would be great.
Of course, yeah, and I didn't want to interrupt, but I'm very glad you invited the interruptions. Thank you so much. You mentioned I'm coming from a machine learning background, so for me, I was very interested in the talk and the topic, and I also have a little bit of a physics background. But I was wondering what you meant by the lack of the iterative process in computational science.
Yeah. So I mean, I agree there is an iterative process in computational science, but if you go look at the models, like for example, if you look at,
Navier-Stokes or something.
I mean, well, Navier-Stokes is different. So Navier-Stokes is special because, of course, if you're solving problems that the Navier-Stokes equation solves, then you just have to solve the equations. But like as we all know, that's kind of a stating it that way is kind of misleading because we actually can't solve the equations for any problem that we're actually interested in. So then you have to create parameterizations that are actually, accounting for either unresolved degrees of freedom or degrees of freedom because the actual situation is more complicated than the Navier-Stokes equations allows. I mean, consider the climate, right? Like, I mean, it's just a fluid over the Earth that's basically being driven by the sun, and there's some water vapor in it, no problem. But like in practice, the both lack of resolution and I mean the fact that like it's not only that it's not like there's not resolution today and there will be enough next year. It's like there will never in the lifetimes of anybody in this room or any of our children or children's children be enough compute to basically solve these problems at the level of resolution that is required. So there's always modeling. And whereas the machine learning community, and I think the recent advances in large language models are a really good example of this. I mean, I don't know how into this all of you guys are, but like there are benchmarks. Like you can go and look at large language model benchmarks, and they were there are classical NLP benchmarks, but like the community is constantly upgrading. I mean, like there's this thing that just came out, humanity's last exam. Like the benchmarks are getting harder and harder on problems to solve, and then everyone is competing their models against this set of benchmarks. And I mean, I guess large language models have now become such an important part of our economy that nothing is open sourced anymore. But like up until a couple of years ago, the machine learning, I mean, your community, Rick, everything was open sourced. Everything, the code could be reproduced by anything. Where, there's, go to papers with code and you can see on any problem what the leaderboard is. And then you could, if you want to basically improve upon it, you basically could just improve upon it and you could show how you did relative to the last people. If you contrast that to climate modeling or, the field of making molecular potentials, like there are lots of important fields, or frankly, protein structure prediction, that's a good one too, right? This just didn't happen. Like there's no, like most code is non-reproducible. The benchmarks are like shifting. People enter into a problem and say, oh, I think I'm going to try a new effect. And so they effectively invent a new benchmark, but they don't actually compete their methods on all the old benchmarks. It's just much more disorganized. I don't know if
It's such a great point. I mean, even with the data sets now with these large language models are closed. And so we don't have access to data sets as well to use. It's insane.
But I mean, if you look at papers with code and if you look at LM sets, sorry, I'm like really kind of deeply into this. I mean, if you look at the large language leaderboard, they will tell you performance across a set of standard benchmarks, right, for all models, and people report them when they come up with a new model. And so, at least the competition is occurring against a uniform set of evolving benchmarks. And I just think that point, which to me is just being careful scientifically, it has nothing to do with machine learning. It's just like, let us be careful. We could easily do that in the physical sciences, and I think that we just haven't, basically. And I think that this is a major problem. I think this is to me, this is the major lesson that people like me should take away from the machine learning community, that it's not about, I mean, of course it's about, I mean, maybe there are ideas of machine learning too, but I don't, but this is a structural thing about the community and the way that funding occurs, the way that everything occurs, which I think is a major problem. And I think that like the fact that, we've seen like, 5 years ago, none of us would have believed what these language models could do. I mean, actually, like a month ago, I wouldn't have believed what they can do today. Actually, I'm like, right. I mean, I just think it's remarkable what's happening. But like, meanwhile, our molecular dynamics potentials for solving, dynamics of proteins, I mean, it hasn't advanced at all. I mean, roughly. I mean, it's really not the same. But then you say, well, how would I measure that? And like, there is no benchmark set. I mean, the big counterexample to this, of course, is AlphaFold. But the reason that AlphaFold was able to do this is because of CASP. It was because there was a benchmark that was set up on that problem that was very well defined. Like the PDB, all protein structures are stored, and there was a metric, and then there was a community effort to basically find out of sample things. There's a training set, and I will find new ones. You can go compete on them, and so that pushed the field. It was exactly this. But this, across like the things I have on the slide, like it just doesn't happen, and I think it's really a missed opportunity. I don't know if this makes sense. That's what I mean by iteration. It's not that people don't iterate, they do. It's just that they iterate in an unorganized fashion. And I'm guilty too. Sorry, just to be clear, I spent my whole life on this, and I feel like we've just basically failed.
A structured approach to reproducibility might sort of help that as well.
Yeah, reproducibility is also, I think that reproducibility, having a culture where everybody can reproduce what others have done is also important. And I think that the machine learning libraries, and just the culture has kind of driven that to occur. Whereas if you go work in the field, just to take an example of something that won't be in this talk, but I think this is totally fair, of molecular machine learned potentials. So clearly, like if you have potentials like between objects, entities, and molecular dynamic simulations, you can do high resolution, much higher expensive calculations of them using the Schrodinger equation or whatever, and you can then derive machine learned potentials that are going to accurately parameterize at some scale. And there's a whole field of people that are doing this and use this for materials discovery. They do not compare. They have not up till this moment created benchmarks to compare. You never know who's better. You hear a talk like, "Oh, look what I did! Isn't it amazing?" And you raise your hand and say, "Could you please compare it to the last 3 talks like this that I've heard?" And they just aren't set up to do it. And people have good reasons. It's like, oh, people don't open source their code. It's too valuable, like all this stuff. And I guess my, high level observation is that like, if you take large language models, it's changing the economy. It's going to change the way we teach. It changes everything. It couldn't be more valuable, but yet, for a long time, everything was open sourced and it was okay. I mean, sure, at some point you might pull it back, but anyway, I don't know if that makes sense. Sorry, I think I'm sorry for belaboring this point, but at some level, this is my main point. And I've basically designed a research program to try to go after this. And I'm not sure we're doing very well yet. I mean, we're trying, but I wish more people would, because I think this is the critical issue. Like there's all this stuff on pins and this and that. And I just have no patience for any of it. I just could we please focus on the problem, basically? Sorry, I don't know, Ricky, that was a long answer, but I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. And I'm so sorry. I wish I could stay. I have to run for a class,
No,
but
it's okay. I
I'll be
understand.
coming in for the recording.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Other questions, comments?
No.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just start out by giving you a gallery of problems that we've been working on this way. So I'm literally just going to give you a list. The list basically has the feature that all of the things have papers associated with it. If you're interested, you can go look at it. And then I will just either randomly, or you can convince me to choose some of the items on the list to sort of tell you more specifically. But we've been quite intentionally going after a broad range of problems because this is inherently methodological, of course. We are not right now creating benchmarks, as you will see, although some of these problems have benchmarks inherent in them. So maybe we are doing that. Okay, so gallery. So, okay, so this line of research we started in around 2018. It started, the first paper that I wrote on it was with a postdoc named Yohai Bar Sinai, who's right now in Israel. He's a professor in Israel, and what we decided to do, sort of motivated by, actually at the time we didn't really realize what I just said, but our idea was that you could take machine learning, you could take PDEs and discretizations of PDEs, and you could code them. At the time we were using TensorFlow in a machine learning language. And then our thought was that, well, what one would like to do is to solve the equations at lower resolution, of course, but while maintaining accuracy. And of course, there's a long history in numerical analysis of building methods that allow you to do this. But what we thought was that maybe we can just use the automatic differentiation capabilities within the solver to basically numerically solve for the discretizations. And so we wrote this paper, which is actually kind of amusing. I mean, we sort of formulated an optimization problem that solved that found the Wino method. For example, if you know it from shop capturing, and we then found other methods that no one had ever found that sort of allowed you to maintain accuracy but on a coarser grid. So that was, and actually the first paper was in one-dimensional PDE. So it was like Berger's equation, Kerr-Moshe-Brzezinski. It was basically just sort of silly things we were trying to get ourselves going. So then we decided we wanted to scale this up, and this is when my colleagues at Google really got involved in earnest. Is that and this is just a list of incredibly talented people. We decided we would sort of do the same thing, but for turbulence, basically, and that was the second paper, to essentially do the same thing that we did in the first paper, but on the Navier-Stokes equations, and try to build coarse grid models. Here, wait, there's another message. Okay, good, that was Ricky. So that was the beginning of this. In turbulence, this is a snapshot of the paper of a figure from the turbulence paper. Basically, at the time the paper is really about 2D turbulence, and basically we for example were able to find discretizations that allowed you to maintain accuracy, but speed up the code by a factor of 100, which is pretty significant actually. And it basically was about learning this update rule. And we would use high resolution solutions as training data, but we would then learn on a coarser grid. And And you know what we basically went after was the discretization in the nonlinearity term in the Navier-Stokes equation. That was what we spent our effort doing. So that was that problem. So this is, you know, with my Google colleagues, this has now evolved in PDEs. We then decided, well, we want to solve an actual problem, right? Like, because turbulence is an actual problem. And it turns out that in the field of weather prediction, there's a data set upon which one can solve an actual problem. It's a data set called ERA5. It's reanalysis data from ECMWF, the European Weather Forecasting Agency. And what they have done is to create a data set of 40 years of data where they basically take observations of weather and they interpolate them with solutions of the equations of motion, and they then publish that on grids of various finements, and that can be used for training data. And that data set has been extremely valuable over the last couple of years, not only to us, but there's a number of other groups. There have really been major advances in machine learning for weather forecasting. The other groups that have done this, I mean, there are a couple. I can talk about this in detail if we get to it, but just to sort of say at a high level, the other groups are all focused on machine learning models, whereas what we did was to literally write the Navier-Stokes equations on a sphere with a finite thickness atmosphere. And within traditional GCMs, there's, you know, in every vertical column, you know, there's like 100,000 lines of code, you know, that are parameterizing the different processes that occur: convection, you know, interaction of water with radiation, things like this. And what we did was we took that entire column and we replaced it with a neural network, a rather simple neural network, which we then trained on the data, basically. And when we did that, we basically found a model which beats state-of-the-art weather prediction up to 15 days. It beats the ECMWF's. I mean, there's now one other pure machine learning model that matches they're basically roughly comparable. Which is called GenCast. It just was published in Nature. This was published in Nature last summer. That was published in Nature like a couple of months ago. And and that's up to 15 days. But then the thing that really blows my mind is that this model is able to predict, you know, for example, this shows you distributions of hurricanes, you know, 1 year out. Actually, no, this plot doesn't show it, but we sort of 1 year out can plot the distribution of hurricanes, and the model basically is more accurate for the future than models that have been, you know, any model that's ever been developed. And our model runs on a single TPU in about 15 minutes. And the sort of other state-of-the-art models are run on supercomputers with tens of thousands of cores, you know, over a much longer time. And I think that this really heralds, this is, you know, to me, a real example of what is possible in the process modeling part of this, that like by building the parameterization into the model, one can really do a lot better. And actually, maybe just to say, to make sure you understand intuitively why that it's saying that this is possible, is that, so the way that we're training this, and if I get to it, I will say more, is that we are literally rolling the weather out for, you know, several days. And we are then matching that against ground truth. So we are training the model not to basically reproduce what happens at a given point in time, but what happens over a time period that's less than the Lyapunov time of the flow. And thereby we're fitting it, you know, over kind of a much more rich data set than you would do it ordinarily. And I think that's the heart of this. And I mean, the only reason that this is possible is because of automatic differentiation technology. Okay, so in the field of fluid mechanics, let me show you two other things. So there's and I should say, I don't actually know what the background of all of the audience is, so people should interrupt me. I don't know if these problems you're all experts in, or you're working in combinatorial optimization and this, you don't know what I'm talking about. So please interrupt me, or I can skip or talk more. I don't. But like, so a classical problem in fluid mechanics, which is actually a problem in fluid mechanics, is an idea that Landau invented in the 1940s, which was, the question was, you know, can you imagine a basis set kind of that you could use to describe a turbulent fluid flow, like some way of understanding it with lower degrees of freedom? And what Landau proposed was a dynamical systems picture in which what happens is his idea was that there are unstable periodic orbits that are in the flow, and that the trajectory of the turbulence, and they're spatial temporal, they're like spatially localized, but they're kind of unstable cycles. And then what's happening is that the trajectory of the flow is sort of approaching and running away from these orbits, basically. That these are kind of the elemental entities that are giving rise to the structures in the flow. And the problem, this gave rise to a research program that's been going on for some time to please find unstable periodic solutions to the Navier-Stokes equations. And turns out to be numerically extremely difficult. And, the community, I think the research program has kind of been blocked because people haven't been able to find very many. And what we did was we said, well, if you have automatic differentiation, you can simply formulate your problem where your loss function is, so tau alpha is a shift operator in time. And you basically just say, I demand that I find a solution which is periodic. I'm actually, capital T is the time shift, and and alpha is actually the space shift, because if the thing is moving, what you'd like is for it to repeat itself after time T, but it's allowed to translate, basically. And so that's the loss function. And we then add constraints to it that we want the dissipation, for example, to be, bigger than some threshold, or we want the period to be something, and we just solve these optimization problems. And to our amazement, if you just solve these with gradient descent, you can find just like you can sort of massively increase the number of known unstable periodic orbits, which one can then use to do turbulence statistics. So this is sort of one problem. There's a paper that's associated with this. Another paper, which is about to come out in PNAS, that was done by an undergraduate and also a very talented postdoc, was, so there's, chaotic mixing. There's you can have two cylinders and one is rotating the other, and you can imagine displacing central cylinder from the center, and then it's sort of well known that if you jiggle back and forth the inner cylinder, you can cause efficient mixing. But the question is please invent the way of jiggling it back and forth that maximizes the mixing efficiency. And this is something, if you have essentially the appropriate code, which is written in a differentiable way, you can just assert this as your loss function, and you can then compute and optimize this. And this is what we've done. And it's kind of amazing. I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever worked on these problems before, but there are lots of technical issues that come up. Like one technical issue, for example, is that chaotic mixing, right? Like, how do you measure chaotic mixing? So, usually mixing is essentially inherently a Lagrangian thing, because, you put a bunch of tracer particles down and you follow them in time and understand how well they mix. But the equations, of course, are Eulerian. And so there's been a lot of work on developing Eulerian measures for chaotic mixers, which we decided that instead of doing that since, according to the equation, we could just optimize the flow, and then we could put the mixers on top of it, and we could just optimize through the Lagrangian calculation on top of an Eulerian calculation. And the model doesn't care. And so we literally optimize directly. And it's pretty cool. It works, quite well. This is the pictures at the bottom are about optimizing porous media under different constraints. I mean, we just sort of lots of fluid mechanics. We've optimized swimmers, and we've optimized all kinds of things. So, okay, so that's sort of fluid mechanics. So another class of problems, actually, which I think is quite interesting, just to sort of change the topic, but I think it's interesting, is sort of models for tissue development. So this is kind of a crazy thing to work on at some level. I mean, because, the way that tissues develop is there are cells, and the cells each, execute their own genetic program, and cells are influenced by the cells in their neighborhood through, lots of different reasons, through excretion of morphogens, through stress, through, other mechanisms, but sort of mechanism, adhesion, and cells are programmed so that when they all interact with each other in this way, the thing grows into a functional thing. And the problem that has existed for a long time, that sort of is finally experimentally, it's becoming possible to see this, is just how does the genetic, how does the rules, forget about genes for a moment, let's just talk about the rules that a given cell execute. How does that relate to the phenotype of the actual tissue? And so experimentally, the field has sort of undergone dramatic advances in the last 5 years, both with respect to imaging technology and also with respect to the ability to look at gene expression within cells, within live tissues, basically, to see what's going on. And so the data is actually starting to be there to do that, but the models have really lagged dramatically behind. And our idea, and this is still very much an idea in progress, was that what we could do is to imagine that every cell is like a particle in a microdynamic simulation, and in every cell, we give the cell a genetic network that basically that describes the genes that are in it. The cell is then able to locally measure its environment, and then it's able to divide, grow, excrete morphogens. It can measure its environment, and then what we do is we literally optimize. We have turned this into a big microdynamic simulation. It's completely ridiculous, but we then optimize the parameters in the genetic network to facilitate, to either find emergent behavior that one might want or to fit the data. And this actually, technically, this was kind of challenging to get it to work. And I guess my point about this is, I've just described a model that's kind of nuts like that. If you told me I was working on it 5 years ago, I would have told you that I would never be so crazy. But, it's not worse. I mean, it's just optimizing a large dynamical system with a bunch of parameters. It's not worse in a way than optimizing a neural network. It's just that everything is interpretable. And so, and of course, if there are things that you like to include that aren't included, that aren't interpretable, you can always just include the neural networks. You model them by general functions, neural networks, whatever you want, as part of it. And so as a modeling framework, it seems to be quite powerful. Anyway, so we just submitted there's a paper on the archive about this where we do things like we, have a group of cells that are dividing, and then, we want them to grow in a line, and the cells basically invent themselves a way. The genetic networks evolved to try to do this. We were able to produce, embryos that grow and then polarize. We can produce shapes, cells that grow into shapes, which then when you cut off the end, it regenerates, and this sort of thing. And we're right now, actually, the graduate student who did this work got so excited by this that she now has moved to UCSF, an organoid engineering lab, where she's trying to actually instantiate some of the computations that she did in experiments. And I mean, the whole thing is kind of nuts, but like on the other hand, it wasn't possible to think about these things before. So, because that's
just to interrupt, do you have a reference for this?
I do. I have references for all of these things. If you just look for papers I've written in the last year on the archive, all of this is on the archive.
Okay.
And you can send me. I'm happy to just send you, after this talk, if you want, like just a list of all the papers that underlie it, and you can distribute it if people are interested. Because sorry, at the rate I'm talking, I think I'm going to end up being at a high level of what we're doing and why we're doing it, and there's not going to be a lot of room for technical detail. But at least you'll understand what we're doing will make sense, basically. At least I'll have explained. Well, I don't know if it'll make sense, but I'll have explained it. And so if any of it is interesting to any of you, then I'm happy to discuss.
That's perfectly makes sense. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So another sort of class of problems, which I think is quite interesting, are molecular dynamics simulations for soft materials. And this is something that we've worked on for a long time. Not actually just design questions for soft materials, but it's been very difficult actually to design complex materials that were interesting enough with the computer. And so what we do is literally, I mean, in the slide, we have a certain type of interacting entity. The entity that we've become quite fond of are what people call patchy particles, where you have a spherical particle, but on the particle you put patches, and the patches actually are programmed to interact with with the other particles around them in a way that you can design, like who sticks to whom and with what strength, for example. And so there's really a lot of freedom in this, because the particles with the patches, they can be anywhere on the thing, and you then just take a simulation and you say, I'd like you to grow in X, and see how it goes. And so what we do is we formulate the optimization problem in terms of the design of the way that the particles interact. We do a forward molecular dynamics simulation. We design some loss function, which is, for example, if you're trying to grow into a certain structure, please measure the distance of the targeted structure from the structure. And we then basically do gradient descent, and we just train these things. And we've built, one of the things that we've done in the last couple of years is to build a differentiable molecular dynamics package that is able to do this for patchy particles, which is itself kind of a big undertaking, but we feel that it has a lot of uses, and I'll show you some of them here. I mean, these are examples from the paper. There's a paper that came out on PNAS last year that sort of went through the design, and also the code for this is all open sourced. Everything is open sourced, so you can all, if anyone's interested, you can go play with it. I mean, we did things, and I mean, this is still kind of silly, but like, design particles that will form spontaneously into Kagome lattices. This is what happens if you use random designs, and this is the design of the system, that forms Kagome lattices with high yield. This is the panel on the right is a paper that was just published in Physical Review Letters, where what we did was we designed the interactions of a catalyst and a particle to cause a disassembly reaction. The idea was that you start out with a closed shell, and that then something comes in, and something is this kind of object here with the red tip and the black things. These are particles in molecular dynamics simulations, and that this then sticks to the cluster. And then what we did was to design the interaction so that when it sticks, it basically pulls off the particle on the top, and it then disassociates. And we simply train the reaction by playing with the potentials within them. And then the shell can release a particle. But I mean, our point was not really that this design, is itself interesting, just that one could really very carefully do these sorts of things, which I think are quite novel from a computational design point of view. So let's see, other things. We're very interested in another sort of class direction that one can go with this is to ask about energy input. Like suppose you have a molecular dynamic simulation that assembles like what I just showed you before. So these are all in equilibrium. So the yields, we measure yields for things like this when we optimize that are equilibrium yields. But we of course know if you look at biology that energy is used in very particular ways. And so an interesting question is to understand how energy input can actually, lead to behavior basically that's targeted. And so we have systems in which we do that maybe I won't describe here that we're still actively working on to solve things that I think are pretty interesting. So another thing that we've done, and this was a student named Ryan Kruger who is just graduating this year, is what we wanted to do was to see if we could use these anisotropic particles to actually make a macroscopic model of something that is experimentally important. And we chose DNA models of DNA and RNA because there are communities that basically make models of DNA and RNA in this way. And what they do is they take a molecular mechanics model like this. So this is like, you have constituents that look like these pieces, and they then, when you put the pieces in a box, they form into a DNA or an RNA, and then but then the question that they have is, well, how to choose the parameters? And there are tons of parameters in these things because, you can kind of see the different colors, and each of these entities has an interactin potential around it that itself might have some large number of parameters. And what you of course want is for it to match experimental data. And there's like lots of different types of experimental data for, the behavior of nucleic acids for DNA and RNA. Like you could imagine, for example, measuring melting temperature for different sequences. That's sort of one type of data, like thermodynamic data. You also can imagine like it's a big polymer, so you can stretch it out and see how its radius of gyration changes with force. And then you also could look at structures that form of DNAs and try to cancel those. And what people tend to do is to try to twiddle the parameters in the potentials to match some set of structures. I mean, this gets back to the comments I was making about benchmarks before. The benchmarks aren't formulated very cleanly. And it's literally usually a lot of twiddling. And so what we've done is to invent a way of taking these types of measurements and literally directly fitting the parameters of potential by solving an optimization problem. And this sort of required what I would call, I think, really tour de force technical problems to overcome, to be able to do. Like Ryan, I mean, the problem being that like, if you're gonna, for example, fit potentials to match melting temperatures, or thermodynamic transitions. Thermodynamic transitions occur from extreme events. And so you need to basically have very long trajectories where you can accurately measure the probability of extreme events. But if you're going to then use that data to fit the potentials, then you're going to end up with way too much data to be able to do in a computationally efficient way. And so there were like lots of technical problems that, I mean, we could give whole lectures on how to do this, but we managed to basically finally make it work. And there's a paper that is on the archive that's under review at the moment on doing that we're actually quite excited about, both because of mainly because of what it implies, actually, that one can do going forward. So another thing Ryan did, sort of using these same methods, was that you could, of course, take potentials in molecular dynamics simulations that people have fit otherwise, and then solve optimization problems on top of them. So there's a paper on the archive that we put out in the last couple of months on taking potentials that people have designed for amino acids in intrinsically disordered proteins where there aren't structures, and to try to basically show that we can optimize. If you assume the potentials are correct, you can solve optimization problems around them to basically, demand that the proteins obey certain properties. Like, for example, maybe you want it to have a target radius of gyration. Maybe you would like it to have one radius of gyration at one pH and another one at another pH. Please find the sequence that does that. And we've sort of set it up so that we can literally differentiate over the sequences to basically find these things. And this actually, these GIFs are basically showing you the sequence optimization for some of these, just to show you that it's literally, there are 20 amino acids and it's optimizing over all of them. And even though they're discrete, one can basically play tricks, computational tricks, and make it into a continuous optimization problem that one uses gradient descent to solve. So I guess, so that's like a nutshell of the types of problems that we've been working on. They go from molecular dynamics with various applications to PDEs. I have like 15 minutes left. we can just talk about this if you want. I mean, like, or I could sort of go into an example. I don't know what would be helpful.
It's up to you, Professor. This is all meaningful. We are enjoying. So,
I mean, like maybe let me ask because I don't know anything about the audience. I mean, what kinds of problems are you guys interested
well,
in?
we our background is in fluid, so most of the example which you have given, that was really perfect. And
Okay, so maybe I should include the fluid mechanics example. So okay, so let's talk about fluid mechanics a little bit, and I'm going to go through these. Maybe what I'll do is talk about the neural GCM and talk about inverse boundary problems. Maybe that would be a good thing. And I'm going to just all the rest of it I'll just smush and delete. If anyone's interested, we can talk about it. I'm gonna, let's see, I talked about this stuff. Forgive me, there are too many slides here. Let me talk about the neural GCM and inverse boundary, and I'll just give a little more detail than what I gave. I don't have really a lot of time, but like at least I'll give some more flavor of what I mean. Okay, so this is machine learning based weather prediction. I sort of told you the problem is that you're given the state of the atmosphere at one time and you'd like to predict it some amount of time later. If you're interested in like several day out prediction, this I think is for 3 day out weather prediction, and this is skill. There's just been extraordinary progress in the last couple of years. This is basically the state of the art as of January 2022, and you can see that a couple of the machine learning models have beaten this baseline, and there's a series of Nature papers about this. These are all pure machine learning models. And what we wanted to do, basically being rooted in fluid mechanics, was, and this is just putting words into what I said, putting equations into what I said in words before, is we took the Navier-Stokes equations on a globe. We actually solved them in the quasi-static approximation, the geostrophic approximation, the vertical, if this means anything to you. So we actually assume that, which is not, I mean, it's actually not the way that standard weather models are written. They tend to be dynamics in the vertical. We just, for ease of computational efficiency, simply assume that it's not, that the vertical is in quasi-equilibrium. We then wrote a solver for this that's been open source, that is in JAX, and that is written, on it's a spectral solver actually, that's written on a globe. And then what we do is that in every vertical grid cell, we need a physics parameterization of this thing. And the physics parameterizations that exist in GCMs are rather complicated, and we simply replaced the whole thing. Our idea was just to learn this from data using our differential solver. And so the way that this is set up is rather straightforward. We basically have the Navier-Stokes equations, we have some residual correction, and we basically train the residual correction on the data, which includes all of these unknown physical processes. We don't, in the current instantiation, you could imagine pulling out some of the processes separately. Like, for example, in the atmosphere, the obvious one to pull out is radiation. We actually have a very good understanding of how radiation interacts with water vapor, so there's no reason to parameterize it. But we didn't even do that. We just trained the whole damn thing. And so this is the way that it basically works. There are inputs. We input some noise basically because we're interested in actually long time simulations, and we basically are training this thing over ensembles, if that makes any sense to you. We put in the forcings that existed every time, like the sun, the solar forcing, and things like this. And we then have a dynamical core. We have learned physics. We put them together. We have ODE solvers, and then we produce outputs. And basically, we just train this damn thing, right? And we train it over 3 to 5 days of era 5. The interesting thing is that
one question, Professor. Here you are basically using the encoder decoder based approach, right? But what's in the latent space? Which architecture are you using?
The encoder and decoder are just going. So actually, in this case, there is no the model. So these are the Navier-Stokes equations. So the encoder. This is the Navier-Stokes equation. This is literally taking ERA5, which is in one mesh, and putting it on a different mesh that's better used for. It's like these are interpolants basically. They're not. These aren't what you usually meet in encoder decoders, where there's a latent space. I mean, there is a latent space, but it's just an interpolant onto a mesh. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yes.
So it's a so really the core of it is we have discretization of the dynamical core, we have discretization, we have a neural network that's replacing this, and then we have an ODE solver, and we're basically just solving with a simple method, basically.
So I have a question. Like in the weather prediction, climate modeling comparison that you did, like several models like ForecastNet, DeepMind, all like what make a model like, for example, the DeepMind model performing like outperforming the rest of the models, because I think it's like capturing turbulence, right? The main part of predicting climate is like capturing the turbulence. How does
Well, I mean,
the
okay, so
model
there's a
work?
lot of uncertainty in the learned physics. I mean, so the physics, like getting back to this, like all of these processes, there's a lot of, I mean, people have put in parameterizations for all these things that are based on physics, and they've been tuned over time. And I think basically the reason that the machine learning models are outperforming the traditional models is because we're just doing we're learning this from data, and we have a lot of data, and we're doing a better job of, the parameterizations are just better, basically. I think that's why. It's like, you might think that it's good to, I mean, I'm a physicist, so I would like to think that like the laws of physics were important, but like, it just turns out that there's enough uncertainty in them and there's enough data basically to train on that you're better off just ignoring what you know, except for in our case, and this is the one place where this is the key point where we kind of disagree. We're using a different approach than both of the DeepMind approaches. I mean, I think that the state of the art models right now, I mean, there are lots of models, but the state of the art are this and the two DeepMind models, which are good in different limits. We can talk about this if you want, but I think we're all just parameterizing differently. And I mean, the key difference for us is that we're doing ours in the context of a PDE solver, whereas their models are actually pure machine learning models. And one consequence of that, just to think about, is that the two DeepMind models take time steps of about 6 hours. So they predict the state of the atmosphere every 6 hours. We are encumbered by the CFL condition, and so our time step is 12 minutes, and we can't break that. And so it's computationally actually much more difficult what we're doing. But like our idea is, and again, this remains to be seen, although I'll show you a little bit of evidence of this, that because we're including the winds and advection by the winds as we know it, we're basically getting mechanisms. We're essentially learning mechanisms that work over much longer times than the times that it was trained. And this thing was only trained for 3 to 5 days, depending on how we set it up. And I'll show you results over a year, basically, which are quite exciting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Professor Brenner, a quick question on the previous slide. So the noise that you're adding here in the slide, is it something that you're explicitly adding in a way to regularize your process of training the model, or
Yeah,
is
that's
it?
a good question. So the reason that we are adding noise, it's not for regularization, actually. The reason that we're adding noise is that the way, and this isn't really apparent in this slide, the way that we train this is by training an ensemble. So, like there's the butterfly effect. I mean, everyone says like the weather, can you really predict the weather because it's chaotic? And
Right.
the answer is that, well, there's only up enough time, which is a couple of days. So up to a couple of days, then it's pretty deterministic and you can predict it. But if you want to predict out to a year or even 15 days, which is the sort of time of the weather forecast on your phone, it'll go out 2 weeks, right? Then you somehow have to take into account the stochasticity
Yeah.
of the dynamical system. And so the DeepMind basically has two models, one that is deterministic and one that is a diffusion model and is stochastic. So the way that we deal with this is that we basically create different initial conditions by injecting noise basically into the initial conditions of the model. And we then roll them all out. And then when we learn the physics, we actually learn it by trying to match the mean of the ensemble. So we actually train it. We train the stochastic process. We're basically treating the underlying model as stochastic, and we're training it that way. And when you do that, then it just turns out to be magical.
Right. So just to structure my thinking process, just to make it clear. So the utility of the noise addition here is that it kind of helps you in being more certain about the future predictions of the weather. Is that right?
Well, let me sort of say it slightly different. So if you take the model and you start with one initial conditions and you run a forward simulation 2 weeks out, you will
Right.
get some answer. If you then change the initial conditions slightly that
Yeah.
are still consistent with what we know, then you
Okay.
will get a slightly different answer. So if you then do that 1,000 times, you will get a distribution of answers. And what you would really like to do is to train and what we have is the mean. So what ECMWF gives you is the mean of that distribution. They don't give you an individual realization. So what you'd really like to do is train to match the mean. And that's what we do.
Right. And it's more like a Bayesian approach of computing the end.
It is, but we're not even being Bayesian about it, actually. We're just
Right.
computing the mean. We're literally doing what I said, literally. Actually,
Right.
although it turned out our ensemble worked very well with only 2 members. So
Okay.
we basically have 2 members and we basically unroll them both, average them, and then use that to basically fit.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
So which basically makes it possible to predict accurately very far out. So I don't know, these are 2 movies sort of show you that they kind of look the same. Let me see. Let me see what to say. So this is what we do. I mean, I should just emphasize this. I said this in words that we are unrolling over many time steps, right? It's 12 minutes time steps, and it's over, say, 3 to 5 days. So you can do the math, thousands of time steps. So this is computationally non-trivial, but we basically, after fighting with it for some time, managed to make it work. And so the neural GCM, is competitive for 3 to 5 day predictions. I'm not going to talk about this slide. But also the neural GCM was the first model that beat the ensemble weather forecast on most metrics. And so this is a plot which shows one variable that people tend to use as a function of lead time. And this is the ensemble neural GCM, is the blue curve, which was trained as I just described. And this is ECMWF's ensemble. And I think this was I mean, the fact that this is possible, ours is much faster. Ours runs on a single TPU, in minutes, basically, for 15 days. The DeepMind GenCast
Just
came
one
out after this plot. Yep.
Professor, here, do you have any comparison with this paper, Pangu weather prediction from
Pangu weather. So GraphCast actually is this curve, which you'll notice is quite competitive up to 5 days. And in fact, Pangu was here. Here was Pangu weather, and this chart was 3 day out predictions. This was short predictions. So we actually are doing slightly better than Pangu on this metric. But the point is that and actually this thing, there's this wonderful website. There's a person at Google named Stefan Rasp who has this thing called Weatherbench, which compares according to many different metrics over many different lead times, all these models to each other. So actually, if you're interested in Pangu, this was made 6 months ago. So GenCast didn't exist. GenCast is now on there, and you can look at our performance, and then you can look at these different, and you can just measure. These are RMSEs. You can see how we're doing. So relative to for different lead times, and this is up to 10 days basically. And so, I mean, generally the neural GCM ensemble outperforms all of these things. It's essentially equivalent to GraphCast up to for short lead times. I mean, you can see up to 5 days. They're really very similar. But then over longer lead times, GraphCast is deterministic, and so it can't compete. But if GenCast, which is the new model that just came out, actually does go out to 15 days, and they are slightly better than us according to all these metrics. We were the first model to beat the CMWF ensemble, and they've also done it. They're using a purely diffusion model. And so does that answer the question?
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let me just show you one other thing, and then maybe I'm out of time, so we should stop and we can take questions. So this is our model relative to, I mean, at the time, relative to the state of the art model up to 15 days. But what I want to sort of just point out maybe in my last minute is that what kind of really surprised us was that we could use the neural GCM trait on weather, and we could use it to predict climate 1 year out. And this is an example. So climatology, is sort of using historical trends to predict the variation in global mean temperature. ERA5, that's what you get from ECMWF. And the blue line is the prediction from our ensemble, basically. And I mean, we track global mean temperature quite accurately. This is the sort of ECMWF ensemble for 5-day forecasts of a hurricane. And these are our predictions, and it's quite consistent with the ECMWF ensemble. This is for short-term hurricane, and the one that really blows my mind, and actually, is this the best picture? Let me show you this. Let me show you this one. So this is basically predicting 1 year out tropical cyclone. Where are the tropical cyclones? How many are there at every point on the globe 1 year out? And this is basically the distribution that we predict with the neural GCM, and this is what you get from reanalysis data. And if you compare this to what existed before the neural GCM, which is a model that NASA puts out that runs on 20,000 cores, it's not even close. The performance is way below it. And I think this I just find very appealing, the idea that by building a better parameterizations model, over short times, one can predict longer, accurately over long times. We can't go out longer than this right now because we only have an atmospheric model. You need to predict, to predict out further than that, you need, the ocean, you need oceans and land and things like this, but this at least shows what's possible. So maybe I'll just stop there. I appreciate your attention. I'm sorry I didn't get through very much of it, but hopefully I at least gave you some insight into what we're working on and also why we're doing it.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Professor. Siddharth?
Yes, thank you, Professor Brenner, for an amazing talk. Just wanted to have another question on the training process of the neural GCM. So is it right to say that, I don't know if it's technically correct in a way, but is it right to say that it's more of like a training that's done in an auto-regressive fashion? And
Yes, it's autoregressive.
so it's an autoregressive case. In that case, have you ever felt or experienced error getting accumulated during the process? And is
Oh,
there
yes.
Yes.
Yes, this is very fraught, actually. So, I
Uh,
mean, that
yeah.
is running over long time windows. I mean, for example, if you train over longer than a Lyapunov time, you can't do that. So notice I said 3 to 5 days. That was carefully chosen. It's also the case that, like in some of the work that I was telling, that I sort of went through very quickly with, training potentials over DNA, over a long time scale process in DNA, we actually had to invent a way of training that was different than simply training over some measure of the trajectory.
Right.
Otherwise, it doesn't work.
So if you think about a cyclone, for instance, I believe it can be called as a rare event. So it's not something you'll have a surplus data of. So for such kind of cases, what would be your typical time step, like for a scenario like cyclone prediction?
Well, for cyclone prediction, we're using a time step that's set by the CFL condition, which is like,
Right.
depending on resolution, it's like 12 minutes, say, something like that.
Right.
So we're just running a stable numerical solver. But then for training, we have to use that time step, because otherwise, I mean, you're free to sample the time series when you do training if you want. But like, we haven't found that makes that much of a difference. I mean, this is a project that the neural GCM, like I tell people, like we were very lucky that we could do this at Google because we had enough computers to pull this off, right? I mean, I don't, for example, in my academic life, I don't have enough computers to do this. The number was something like we burned like 150,000 TPU hours in training these models.
Yeah.
And so so we didn't worry about things like this. And I think that they were necessary too. Like ablation tests on everything haven't been done, but this is kind of expensive. On the other hand, these other things, I mean, just to give you everything else I've talked about, like this, which I didn't talk about. I mean, we've done these all on the GPU cluster at Harvard, and our group, we bought, I mean, we own 8 A100s, which is actually a lot. And Harvard has a bigger one that we have access to, and that's been enough. We were very careful about choosing problems, that are
and for the optimal mixer problem that you discussed, I think very long back in one of the initial slides, what is a typical objective that you use for such kind of a problem? I don't think you did mention it about.
Just like, for example, compute the mean square dispersion of tracer particles in the flow. Please maximize that.
Okay.
On average, like that. And, we literally, I think I have a plot actually. Let me see. Sorry, this is all. Here's optimized swimming kinetics. We did this. I mean, chaotic mixing. So here, like this, like, compute mean square displacement as a function of time. This is mean square displacement over 2t as a function of time, and there's a plot. Please optimize this.
Okay.
Right, that number. And what I find really fun is that we literally could write a differentiable solver that optimized over this.
Right.
Which is what you want.
Yeah.
And then what we would do is that was kind of inefficient because you have to do whatever, but then we would invent surrogate methods that were more computationally efficient, but we would make sure they matched that. So we were still, like, I think we were being pretty rigorous with respect to this. So.
Thank you. And I presume you are using JAX-CFD for all of the training data that you're gathering for
We're using JAX-CFD. Well, we use JAX-CFD for the velocity field. It's a modified version of it, which allows you to put particles in. We have an immersed boundary version of it, which is now, like, there's a paper on the archive. If anyone's paper, send it to me. And there's a GitHub that's associated, which has an immersed boundary. So you can put particles in and other things. That's basically what we use for these things.
So. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for.
Anyway, everybody, I really appreciate it. I unfortunately have to run to another meeting. Sorry, my life is.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. And it was a really wonderful talk. So we would love to have the references. So maybe I'll send you a separate email for that.
Yeah, send me an email and I'll just send you a set of references.
Okay.
But I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you all. And I'm sorry that was somewhat chaotic and brief. So
yeah, but yeah, really, it was really wonderful. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.